So today, just to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about, I want to give you a little bit of background to the project, just the reasons why I thought it might be important to do, and looking at the aims and objectives. I'll explain a bit about the methodology that was used for the research, and then go into a little bit of the contents of the pack. We have some feedback and outcomes as well. Sorry, it's going a bit fast. Feedback and outcomes. So I'll talk about that as well, and some survey results, and then the future plans. So at first, I suppose, to look at a bit of background, as most people know, in the brain injury program, the NRH, sorry, I hope you can hear me. I'm going to have to get a message. My internet connection's unstable, so hopefully it's okay. So yeah, the interdisciplinary team, they work with adults with acquired brain injury and help them to achieve meaningful goals to improve their quality of life. So a lot of the patients would be parents. So I think we felt there was a need to ensure that the goals would be meaningful for patients. And obviously people who are parents, their children are often their priority. So I think we felt there was a need to look at including them a bit more. There's also in research globally, there's an increased emphasis on family-focused rehabilitation. And a lot of the research would say that the outcomes for patients is better when families are included. And we would obviously always include families, but often that would be the spouses or partners or carers. So there wasn't really a consistent approach to including child relatives. It would depend on, I suppose, the comfort level of therapists. Some people would include children, some wouldn't. So there was just a need for more consistency, I think. And in terms of the research itself, I felt I wanted to do research really that had a practical application. So that it wouldn't just hopefully sit on a shelf and would be used by services. I've included some quotes there that you can see as well. And these are direct quotes from children that we would have worked with. And I think they show, like, for example, the 5-year-old boy there, I think my brother gave mum a stroke because he slept on her bed and had his leg pushed against her neck all night. So I think really it shows, and a lot of those quotes here show, the second one there, I knew what was happening. Mum went to hospital first, now I don't know. I think what it shows is a lot of confusion for children and they need more information. So I think if we can include them and give them more information, it's a better outcome for everybody really in the family. So the aims and objectives then, and following on from that, the aims and objectives of the research was to strengthen the family approach to rehabilitation and to support staff to be more inclusive of child relatives. It was also, I suppose, to give staff the confidence really, and to give them an actual tool that would help them to work with children directly, but also to support families to work with their own children. So I suppose it's important to note that this isn't saying that everybody who works in rehabilitation has to work directly with children. I think the point is that everybody should have, I suppose, should help family members to remember to include their children. And obviously it's a very traumatic time for people, and sometimes partners of adults with brain injury have so much to focus on, and they may not be able to focus on their children. So I think the hope is that this would give them the tools, so give staff the tools to kind of help talk to the parents and try and help them to work with their children, to include them. So the methodology for this research. So first I did a literature review, looking at the current research on the impact of acquired brain injury on child relatives, and also the impact on parenting capacity. So there would be quite a bit of research out there on the impact of children, which I'll get into a bit later. I also did some consultations, firstly with some social workers in the NRH that would have worked with children, either on the PEDS program or with the adult services as well, working with siblings or children of patients with acquired brain injury. I consulted as well with members of the interdisciplinary team. I wanted to gauge from them what they would like to see in a pack and what information would be helpful to them, and what's missing. So I drafted a draft pack, which was piloted for 6 months on one brain injury ward in the NRH. So the feedback from that, I suppose, it was quite positive. There wasn't really any changes recommended to the content as such. So it was just some suggestions about readability and layout. So we did, I suppose, officially then design a pack and had an official launch in October 2018. And at that, we had Dr. Audrey Daisley speaking. She's a neuropsychologist in the Oxford Centre for Enablement. And I suppose in a way she was the inspiration for the pack. And she would have helped us a lot and given a lot of guidance on where to go about starting the research project. So she spoke at it, but also we had a parent with an acquired brain injury who was a past patient of the NRH who spoke at the launch as well. And I think that was very useful for people just to see, I suppose, the reality of brain injury. And he spoke about his experience, but also the fact of being a father and how that's impacted on his children and their relationships even afterwards. And then I suppose we did, after about a year of that, we did a follow-up survey just at the start of this year. I did, to get a more kind of outcome assessment, I looked at SurveyMonkey and did a survey. So we'll talk about that a bit later as well. So just to give you a look at the pack, obviously if this wasn't virtual, I'd be able to kind of show you the pack physically. So we just have a picture there, but so it's a resource for rehabilitation teams, and it's divided into 3 sections. So the first section is more the literature review results and just some information. So there's information on the impact of brain injury in child relatives, so how children are impacted in terms of the immediate impact, obviously, of dealing with a parent who might have changed personality or changed traits or memory problems. It also looks at, I suppose, the other effects on children, like if the relationship has changed between the parent and the child. There's also information on the impact of brain injury and parenting capacity, which actually the next slide will just go into that in a little bit. And I just had some other writings about the rehabilitation benefits of promoting resilience and the benefits of family-focused rehabilitation. I suppose I didn't want it to be, it's not all about the negative impacts, and I suppose it's important to point out that there can be some positive outcomes from having a brain injury in terms of working on relationship and family relationships working together. So this is just a sample. This is one page from section 1 on the impact of brain injury on parenting capacity. So it's just to give, I suppose, I wanted to give a practical tool and show some practical, especially for new therapists or new staff starting. They could look, they may have, obviously they'd have an understanding of the impact and the problems and impairments that are arising from brain injury. So it's just to look at practical examples of how these impairments would affect a child. So for example, I mean, obviously attention difficulties is an obvious one, but it's just to look at how that might affect a child. So when the children bring friends home from school, parents might not cope with the noise or extra demands. And there's lots of examples of that, like the everyday memory problems could impact on a child when the parent might forget the route to school or mightn't remember to give them their school lunch. And obviously then there's behavioural and emotional impacts as well. And there's, I suppose, impulsivity would be one where a parent might change decision that's important to a child without offering any explanation. So it's just to try and, I suppose, I wanted to put in context how an impairment might affect the daily lives of children, and down to the practical impacts. Obviously, if a patient can't drive, then it's difficult to plan activities with the child, and the parent might have to rely on somebody else. And that obviously impacts on also on the relationship with the child and the parent, because they mightn't be able to go together, just the two of them somewhere, and they might have to always have the other parent or a friend or somebody else to help them. So that has other impacts as well. So the second section of the pack is more practical. So this has practical interventions. So we would look at some practical tips on how to help children cope with brain injury. For example, giving children age-appropriate information, always including them in the process, having Skype phone calls with the children between the parent and the child, having photos, making the room, the brain injury patient's room, have pictures of the child there so the child can see that they're involved and included. So there's a lot of practical suggestions and tips that everybody could use on making the environment more child-friendly and making the experience of the patient more suitable and appropriate for their children. There's also common questions that would be asked by young children, aged up to age 12, and also by teenagers. So this is a list of questions and then have suggestions on how to answer those questions. So like for younger children, trying to explain that the brain, there's a question, what is the brain? And the answer is, it's like a command center in a spaceship. So when there's damage, then the command center can't help the person to function properly. So, and the workbook that I'll be talking about later coincides with having those common questions as well. So I think, they don't have to be followed verbatim, obviously, the answers, but I think they're just useful, particularly for people who, just are not comfortable or are not sure how to exactly deal with children. And if you don't have any children yourself, or you haven't had any experience of working with children, you mightn't really know the best way to work with them. So I think this section sort of helps with that. It does also have, ideally, what children between the ages of 2 to 6 and 6 to 10 and how they react and how they understand brain injury. So it gives some guidance on how to speak to them and what level of information to provide for them. The final section of the pack are the resources. So there would be a list of websites, books, games, everything that you can give to parents or give to children directly for them. And then there's information leaflets. Now I suppose there's 3 leaflets that are basically a summary of the whole pack. So with all the best intentions in the world, if people really don't want to read a full pack, there's some leaflets. So they're cheat sheets, I suppose, where people can have a quick look. It offers just a little summary of how a child might be affected when a parent, a close relative, has a brain injury, and the tips to support the child relative, the benefits of including them in the rehabilitation process. There's also a list of child support services in Ireland, because obviously, I suppose, there is the possibility when you're working with children that you might need to refer them on to social work or psychology, either in your own agency or further afield. So there's a list of child support services and agencies that should be able to help. There's an appendix at the back, and in the appendix we've got some handouts for parents. So again, just like the little tips for staff, there's 3 handouts that can be given physically to parents. As I'll talk about later, we're planning on making a pack more for parents as well, but this is just the first step in that. And it's useful just to have something, I suppose, to explain and to hand over to parents to kind of encourage them to involve their children. Some parents, as you know, would be nervous about involving the children and feel like it's too upsetting for them and may not want to include or talk to the children at all about the injury. So this is to try and encourage them, and that it's important to include them in some way possible. There's also a workbook attached, and the next slide there is showing a couple of pages, so I'll just move on to that. But it's a workbook called What's the Story When Someone in Your Family Has a Brain Injury. And really it's a workbook that has, there's some information on it, but then there's also space for a child to write their own story and what happened to them and what happened to their family member and their feelings. So it can be given by therapists to working with the child directly. It can be given to parents to work with the children, or if the child is old enough, to give it to them to work away themselves. And it's a good opportunity for them to look at their own experience and how they're affected. So that's just a couple of pages from it, just to give you a sense of what's included in it. So the one on the left there, the nerve center. So that's just a little bit of explaining that the brain is like a nerve center and it controls how we think and talk and feel and everything that we do. And then the second one there is obviously when you have the brain injury, and there it's a meteorite hitting the spaceship, or you can bang it or crack it off something hard. So it's just to try, I suppose, to explain it in child-friendly terms and to explain the importance of the brain and how it can be affected. Also, just to say, actually, the workbook does have opportunity, some other questions and answers as well, and trying to, explain the long-term effects of the brain injury as well. So the pack, as I said, was launched in 2018. So after about a year, we wanted to get some official feedback. we did get some, the initial response, I suppose, and informal feedback was that it was very positive. And we could see that there was a marked change to social work practice. I think a lot of social workers would be engaging more in direct work with child relatives. And I think in terms of goal setting, when teams were setting rehabilitation goals, there was more emphasis on looking at parenting tasks from every level, from physios looking at how a parent can get down on the ground and play with their child and get up again, and for example OTs, helping to help a mother change her child's nappy with one hand, that kind of thing. So it was included. I think it had always been a little bit included. I think it was just more consistent after the pack was delivered. And then at the start of this year, to get a more formal feedback, I did a survey monkey. So distributed a survey to all therapists working in brain injury program in the NRH. The results, it was 15 responses, so I suppose I think I've worked it out at about 30% response rate, which I suppose isn't wonderful, but I think it's telling though, and I've put in a couple of quotes there, but the first two are very positive. It's an excellent resource. I found it very useful, very helpful. But I think in some ways the final comment is the most beneficial, the most telling, because it said I'm unable to comment on the resource back because I haven't seen it. I didn't know it existed. So I think that sort of tells me that it needs to be shown a bit more, and we need to get it out there a bit more. So we are looking at that now. My time is running out. So just to say, it is now on the NRH website, and it's also on the international network in SWABI, so the International Network of Social Workers in Acquired Brain Injury. So we are getting it out there a bit more, and obviously trying to do these kind of presentations. It helps to get the word out there as well. And I'll just quickly go to the future plans. So we are looking at adapting this pack for parents, for the injured and non-injured parents. So we have started looking at that and have a draft. We've done a focus group with partners of past patients to see what they'd like to include it in as well, and they're added to us their own case stories. The spinal team in NRH are looking at a resource pack for child relatives of adults with a spinal cord injury, so it's going to be adapted for that. And we're also hoping, we were hoping to do it this year, which obviously it didn't work out, to look at kid shops. So SIP shops is something that's a program that's run for siblings of children with acquired brain injury, and we're looking at adapting that to kid shops, so children and adults. And the plan is we may have to look at it virtually next year, so we'll see what happens with that. But that's the hope for it. So I just wanted to end. There's a nice quote I found that I think kind of sums it up really. When little children are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join our chaos. And I think it's relevant because ultimately children are so can make little things big and can be so worried and so concerned. And if they're not given enough information or not, age appropriate information, it can be very difficult for them. So I think it's our job to try and include them and give them as much information as we can to try and calm them. So I've just added there the PDF files. I think these will be going out with the presentations later. So this is the link to the resource pack and also to the workbook. So I think my time is probably up. So to say thank you very much for that.